In the frozen void of Day 5, a bloodied ice axe jutted from the snow like a tombstone. Emily Travers had vanished in the Siula Grande whiteout. Her last radio call a whisper of panic. Everyone assumed she was dead. But beneath the ice, Emily was very much alive, fighting to survive. Dawn crept over the ragged peaks of the Cordillera Huayhuash as Leila Mahoney stood at base camp, tightening the straps of her pack. Below her, the Peruvian sky blushed pink against ice-clad ridges. Across the clearing, Emily Travers moved with practiced grace, checking crampons, snapping carabiners into place. To anyone watching, they were two professionals on the brink of greatness. But Leila felt nerves coil in her gut, a quiet reminder of the promise they had made before this trip began. 3 months earlier, in a small climbing gym in Eugene, Oregon, Emily had found Leila nursing a sprained ankle. She had offered a cup of tea and a listening ear when Leila confessed her fears about high-altitude routes. Emily's eyes had glowed with an infectious certainty. "We go together," she'd said, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Up and down, no heroics." And Leila, more comfortable wielding a scalpel than confronting her own doubt, had nodded. That moment, their unspoken contract, had bound them tighter than any rope. Now, altitude hung heavy in the air. Leila recalled the long hours spent poring over topographical maps, marking every crevasse and cornice on Siula Grande's southwest face. Emily's childhood tales of day-long hikes in the Oregon Cascades had first ignited Leila's fascination with vertical worlds. But it was Emily's calm in crisis, her refusal to yield when a sudden storm trapped their Day 4 group on Mount Hood, that convinced Leila she had found more than a climbing partner. She had found a sister in survival. At 6,000 meters, conversation is scarce. Instead, Emily broke the silence, voice muffled by her balaclava. "Ready?" she asked. Leila forced a smile, raising her ice axe in salute. They stood apart, framed by the jagged skyline, two figures armed against an indifferent mountain. Their pact did not need restating. It lived in the rhythm of their breath and the tension in their ropes. Before the climb, over a chipped enamel mug of instant coffee, Emily had drawn a simple line in the basalt dust where they sat. "Here," she'd said, "we start." Then another line for the summit and an arrow looping back. "And here," she pointed, "we finish. Together." Leila had traced it with her fingertip, feeling the weight of every step, every pull, every decision that lay ahead. Now, as the sun gilded the frozen moraine, Emily and Leila exchanged one final glance. Neither spoke of what might go wrong. There was no room for doubt on the face of a mountain that claimed respect with every gust. Together they stepped forward into the hush of high altitude, bound by rock, ice, and the unbreakable summit pact. They did not know that the mountain would demand its own terms. Their boots cracked across the dusty trail out of base camp, each step carrying them higher into the spine of the Peruvian Andes. The sky overhead was an impossible blue, a stark counterpoint to the jagged white of distant summits. Emily led, her eyes scanning the ridgeline as if reading a familiar script. Leila followed close, heart buoyed by adrenaline even as her lungs burned from the thinning air. They paused at Camp Wash, a wind-scoured shelf where prayer flags flapped in a ghostly chorus. Emily methodically unpacked the oxygen cylinders, demonstrating the regulator's click and seal with precise gestures. Leila watched the small movements, storing each in memory. The way Emily's gloved fingers curled around metal, the soft exhale of relief when the mask pressed secure. These details would become talismans if things went wrong. Lower down, crags and crevasses crisscrossed like fractures in the world's backbone. Leila's mind drifted to the Cascades hikes of her youth, when Emily had lifted her trembling hand across a rickety bridge over a rushing river. Back then, Leila had been the fearless one. Now she felt the altitude steal her certainties. She glanced at Emily's profile, sun-etched cheeks, a faint scar above her eyebrow, remnant of a climbing fall 2 seasons ago. Emily never spoke of it, but Leila knew that scar was a map of hard-earned wisdom. Each night, they slept in cold tents pitched on narrow ledges. Emily's whispers drifted through the thin walls as she tested her radio, summoning base camp with crackled chirps. Leila wrote in her journal by headlamp. Weather notes, elevations, pulse readings. The data was her anchor. Yet in the hush before dawn, she heard Emily murmuring dreams, a childhood memory of running through pine forests near Eugene. The alpine. World seemed miles and decades away. Day 2 brought steeper snowfields and the first taste of high-altitude headaches. Emily halted their ascent to demonstrate the frog kick technique in deep snow, knees bent, legs pressing outward in smooth rhythm. Leila adopted the stance, feeling blisters bloom where leather met flesh. Emily passed her a bar of chocolate, and Leila bit into it like an offering from home. The sweetness chased away the dull ache mounting behind her eyes. As they climbed toward Camp 2, clouds curled inward, casting fingers of shadow across the slope. Emily glanced skyward and lowered her voice. Barometers falling. Leila noted the urgency in her tone, the same urgency Emily had when they'd camped through a sudden blizzard on Mount Hood 2 years prior, her calm confidence the only promise of safety. Now the mountain spoke through Emily's measured words. That evening, at 5,200 meters, they huddled in the tent while the wind screamed outside, flinging spindrift across the ice. Leila traced the ridge on her map and placed a small scratch in the corner. One more day survived. Emily uncurled a slender mylar blanket and wrapped it around Leila's knees. The shiny film reflected their headlamp glow back at them, a fragile shield against the void. In the thin hush of high altitude, Leila realized how close she'd come to believing she could conquer this world. But it was Emily's steady presence, her map of memories, her unwavering commitment to their pact, that held the promise of return. Tomorrow, they would push toward the Travers shelf. Tomorrow, the mountain would demand its price, and together they would pay it. By midday on their 3rd day, the wind had shifted from a steady whisper to a low, ominous moan. Leila felt it in her bones as she clipped an ice screw into the hard snow, the metal ringing like a warning bell. Above them, the sky was no longer that impossible blue, but a steely gray, with ragged clouds scudding across the peaks. Emily paused, hand raised, studying the horizon through goggles streaked with frost. Barometers dropped another 3 hectopascals, Emily said quietly, checking the gauge clipped to her harness. Her voice carried an edge of concern, but not panic. She had seen these signs before. Leila's fingers trembled as she fumbled with a loose strap on her pack. A flash of memory cleaved her thoughts. The day on Mount Hood, when Emily had guided her through a sudden whiteout, her calm command saving them both. That memory was the tether keeping Leila from tipping into fear. "I'm seeing it too," Leila admitted, staring at her own instrument. The numbers said they were losing weather fast. Her chest tightened. "Should we consider stopping here?" Emily's gaze swept the slope below, where narrow ledges gave way to vast chasms. "We're too high to dig in safely, and too low to retreat without spending another night on exposed snow." She unbuckled her harness and pulled free a folded sheet of silver mylar. "This will help reflect some heat, but it's not a shelter." She passed it over. Their eyes met behind layers of fleece and Gore-Tex, the unspoken question hanging between them: press on or turn back. Leila felt the weight of their summit pact in that glance. She touched Emily's arm. "Okay," she said softly. "One more push. And then we decide." They resumed the ascent, each step biting into the brittle snow. The wind rose to a howl, flinging brittle needles of ice against their helmets. Emily's rope tugged taut as they navigated a narrow traverse, the mountain dropping away in an unforgiving sweep of white. Somewhere behind them, a loose flake of mylar broke free, fluttering like a wounded bird before snagging on a jagged rock. Leila watched it glitter in the half-light, an ominous premonition she couldn't shake. That night, back in their tent, pitched on a narrow shelf, the storm arrived in full fury. Wind rattled the poles as if the mountain itself were breathing violently, and spindrift slapped against the fabric like icy slaps to the face. Emily ran through the anchor points one last time, her hands methodical even as Leila's heart raced. "Rest now," Emily whispered, sliding her mylar blanket around Leila's shoulders. The silver film caught the glow of their headlamps, turning the interior into a fragile cocoon. Leila pressed the blanket closer, as if it could shield her from the storm's roar, or from the doubts rising inside her. In the darkness, neither dared to speak of what might happen if the weather worsened. They lay side by side, two figures bound by rope and resolve, listening to the mountain's guttural growl. Somewhere beyond the frozen walls of their tent, the air cracked with the promise of danger, and yet dawn would still demand that they step back into the fracture zone, where courage and catastrophe walked hand in hand. Morning light seeped through the tent walls in a diffuse gray that offered no comfort. Outside, the world had flattened into a white blur. Emily peered at the frozen stove, its flame stuttering against the gusts that rattled their shelter. Leila watched her partner's steady breaths, the only sign that she, too, feared what lay beyond the nylon walls. They packed with deliberate calm, stuffing gear into packs slick with frost. Emily's movements were precise, gloves off only long enough to snap buckles, her voice clipped as she ordered coordinates to base camp on the radio. Leila wrapped her mouthpiece tight, each syllable a tether to home, descending in 10. The words felt both promise and curse. Once they turned away from the summit ridge, there was no undoing the choice to descend. They roped up at the tent flap and stepped into the void. Visibility was worse than the night before. Ranges of white, sliding into white, the slope's contour erased. Emily led, axe cutting shallow kicks into the icy surface. Leila's crampons bit reluctantly. Her lungs burned as if pleading for retreat. Behind her, each breath came as a cloud, vanishing instantly. Halfway down the slope, the rope between them froze taut. Emily paused to whack the line free, but as she swung the ice hammer, a sudden blast of wind yanked her hood aside. Leila heard her friend's soft curse swallowed by the storm. The rope snagged again on a hidden rock. They anchored with ice screws and slings, the metal biting into the glacial ice with a ring that sounded unnaturally loud. "Unclip!" Emily shouted, her voice distant in the howl. One by one, each clip released, then reattached. Leila mimicked her, hands fumbling at first, then firming as muscle memory took over. Their seamless dance on the slope had been rehearsed countless times. Yet today, each motion felt underscored by peril. A sudden white wave, more snow than wind, swallowed Emily whole. Leila's heart lurched. She shouted, but her voice swallowed in the tempest. She tugged on the rope, expecting resistance, but found only slack. Panic flooded her veins. "Emily!" She dropped to her knees, clawing at the icy ground, dragging snow aside in frantic swipes. The rope pulsed at her waist, a lifeline to emptiness. Her gloves filled with cold shards as she clawed deeper, voice cracking with terror. Memories of Emily's childhood resilience flashed before her, the fearless girl who crossed rivers on log bridges, never once doubting the other side. Minutes or lifetimes later, the wind abated enough for Leila to rise and scan the slope. Nothing but undulating drifts and the swirl of falling snow. She should have felt Emily's weight on the rope, the pull of her harness. Instead, she felt sudden vertigo, the mountain's enormity closing in. Leila forced herself to descend, sliding an ice axe into the snow, each swing a protest against despair. Every meter away felt like betrayal. She cast frantic glances uphill where Emily should be, clipped in, safe, laughing at the absurdity of a storm. But the jagged skyline remained empty, and only the rope's slack reminded her that her partner had vanished. By the time Leila reached Camp 2, she was trembling, lips blue, body screaming for warmth. She hurled her pack inside the tent and collapsed, the radio still clutched in one hand. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to packs and promises. Inside, Leila sat in the dark, the echo of Emily's last words, descending in 10, reverberating like a vow she could not keep. Leila's fingers trembled as she drove an ice screw into the slope, hammer strikes muffled by the roar of the storm. Above her, the ridgeline was swallowed in an obscuring wall of white. With Emily gone, every flake felt like an accusation. She clipped her rope to the anchor and pitched a tent on the narrow shelf, a flimsy fortress against the relentless wind. Inside, the world became a shuddering cocoon of nylon and frost. Night 1 blurred into a cacophony of rattles and gusts. Leila lay curled in her bag, listening for Emily's radio call, for any sign that her partner had found footing and was on her way back. The storm's howl pressed against her ears, punctuated by the metallic ping of ice bullets slamming the tent. She pressed her palm against the fabric as if she could will it to dissolve and reveal Emily's bright smile. Instead, only white noise answered. By dawn, Leila's hope had become a thin fraying thread. Snow had piled against the tent walls, an improvised grave marker. She forced herself to eat a half-frozen energy bar, each bite tasting of desperation. Outside, the wind-driven snow had erased the trail she and Emily had carved hours before. Leila stepped out, probing the slope with her ice axe, but found nothing. No footprints, no rope, no promise of return. She marked their planned descent route with slings tied to protruding ice screws, each splash of color a desperate semaphore. This way, follow me. Then she retreated into the tent, shivering despite layers of down. Night 2 arrived with a vengeance. Leila counted the hours by the tent's rhythmic creaks, imagining Emily trapped somewhere beyond the storm, waiting for rescue that hadn't come. In the darkness, her mind slipped back to a summer afternoon on Mount Hood. She and Emily had been descending after a successful summit when a surge of warm air triggered an unexpected slide. Emily had lost her footing and tumbled cliffside inches away. Leila, panicked but precise, had anchored herself and arrested Emily's fall with a single arresting motion. She'd hauled Emily back to safety, then tended her scraped elbow as if stitching a wound in her own soul. That day, Leila learned that survival demanded both courage and restraint. Now, alone in the void, she replayed that memory like a mantra. Stay calm, assess, act. She checked her altimeter again, 5,800 meters, and realized she was more vulnerable than she'd ever been. Every breath felt borrowed. Every heartbeat echoed the emptiness left by Emily's absence. On the third morning, Leila unzipped the tent with resolve hardening in her chest. The storm had eased to a brittle whisper. She packed swiftly, leaving behind the mylar scraps and abandoned water bottles, a trail of questions for any who might follow. With one last look at the snow-lashed tent, she clipped onto the rope and began her descent alone, the summit packed, broken but unforgotten. Each swing of her axe into the frozen slope was a plea. Come back, Emily. And though no answer came, Leila carried the faint hope that somewhere beyond the white void, Her friend was listening. Leila's legs gave out just above the Bergschrund, a thin fracture in the glacier they had crossed together. Her fuel canister was empty, her water bottle frozen solid. The slope below was a blur of white and gray, every step an exercise in shattered confidence. She anchored her axe, knelt to catch her breath, and closed her eyes, hoping Emily's calm voice would rise through the wind. Instead, only her own ragged panting remained. She forced herself to stand and follow the rope's line, each swing of her axe deeper than the last. Memories flickered unbidden. Emily's laughter at campfire light, the steady click of her crampons on ice. At times, Leila thought she heard Emily's voice whispering, "Keep moving," though the sound dissolved into the howling gale. Under any other circumstance, she would have steadied Leila with a joke. Now every hallucination was both solace and torment. As the hours passed, the air thinned their thoughts. Frostbite crept along Leila's cheeks and fingers, each numbness a silent warning. She pressed on, convinced she would find Emily waiting at Camp 2, her silhouette bent over a stove, steam warming her cheeks. Instead, she found only abandoned footprints and frost-rimed anchors, signposts of hope that led to nowhere. Mid-afternoon, Leila reached the notorious Travers Shelf. A single misstep here could send her tumbling into an ice-fanged crevasse. She paused, heart hammering so loudly she feared it might shatter the quiet. She thought of their summit pact, scribbled on a scrap of paper in her pack. Up and down, together. She kissed the paper, folded it small, and tucked it against her chest. Then, with deliberate calm, she began the crossing. Each foothold was chosen with surgical care, each swing of her axe an oath. By dusk, Leila spotted the flicker of base camp lights below, a constellation of tents pinned to the moraine. Her breath caught. Rescue or a gathering of friends ready to mourn? She radioed in, voice barely more than a whisper, "Leila here, returning, alone." The crackled reply was a mixture of relief and shock. At camp, teammates rushed forward, pulling her into a down parka and pressing hot tea into her numb hands. Their questions tumbled out. "Where's Emily? Did you see her?" Guilt coiled in Leila's chest like a living thing. She could not answer. Instead, she sank onto a crate by the stove and removed a blank sheet of paper. With shaking fingers, she wrote to Emily's family. That Emily had vanished in a storm, that a search would begin at first light, that Leila would never give up looking for her. Each word felt like confession and requiem. Night fell in a swirl of snow flurries and murmured prayers. Leila stared at her letter, the block letters smudged by tears she could not feel. Outside, the mountain loomed silent and indifferent. Inside, Leila pressed the paper to her heart and whispered into the roaring wind, "Come back to me." Then she folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and drifted into a sleep haunted by Emily's phantom laugh. An echo of the promise they had made on a sunny morning, now tested by ice, distance, and fear. Emily awoke to a world of muted white, each breath a razor's edge in her lungs. Pain lanced through her right leg, sharp, unyielding, and she realized with a surge of panic that her boot had torn away, ankle bent at a grotesque angle. Her gloves were gone, vanished in the tumble that had hurled her into this hidden snowshoot. She lay stunned, half buried beneath the weight of her pack, heart pounding like a frantic drum. Instinct took over. Emily rolled onto her back, gasping as cold seeped through every layer of clothing. Her helmet pressed into the ice above, and she pushed upward, hands raw against the granular snow. Each movement sent electric shocks up her spine, but she refused to yield. She pried off her pack with one arm, dragging it free and using its rigid frame to lever herself forward. Her breath clouded the chute in ghostly spirals. Proof she was alive. Pain flared anew as she shifted weight onto her left leg. Gritting her teeth, Emily slid the pack under her broken limb as a makeshift splint, binding it with the torn straps. She closed her eyes, picturing Leila's calm face, the way her friend had caught her when she slipped on Mount Hood. That memory was a lifeline, proof that vulnerability and resilience were inseparable. With the splint holding her thigh rigid, Emily inched forward on her stomach, one gloved hand searching the snow for purchase. Her gloves had been ripped from her grasp, but she found a buried shard of ice and carved a shallow groove to brace her palm. Blood mingled with snow, dark and defiant. She tasted metal on her lips, not fear, but determination. Time blurred. Emily tracked the slope's angle by tilting her head, guiding herself toward where the sun might be. She tucked a protein bar into her mouth, chewing through frozen nougat as warmth trickled down her throat. Memory drifted back to her brother's voice. "You're stronger than you know." He had fallen when she was 12, and she had carried him from the ravine. The lesson remained etched in her bones. Survival demands ingenuity more than gear. Hours passed. Emily found a narrow ledge and paused, pressing her forehead against the ice to stave off dizziness. She knew she had to find shelter before night. With a grunt, she discarded the remains of her ration and dragged herself toward a small overhang, a natural alcove just large enough to curl into. By stripping layers, she filled every crevice with shredded fleece and mylar wrappers from her emergency kit, weaving a shivering cocoon. In the cramped dark, Emily counted the beats of her heart, tracing each as a testament to her will. She dug a shallow pit in the floor of her alcove, burying the shard of ice she'd used for leverage, a marker of where she had clawed back from oblivion. Every long exhale crystallized on her eyelashes, each inhale bittersweet with triumph and dread. As dusk approached, the wind shifted, rattling the alcove's entrance. Emily pressed against the ice wall, listening to the hollow echoes. Night would bring lethal cold, but she had a plan. She would use the alcove as a base, ration her strength, and wait for a chance to crawl toward base camp. Her body trembled, but her spirit, forged in Oregon's forests and tempered by alpine storms, burned bright. In the white silence, Emily Travers vowed to live and to keep fighting until she saw Leila's face again. The first light of day, 6 brought nothing but deeper cold and a hollow ache in Emily's lungs. She pressed her back against the ice alcove, knuckles white as she traced the shallow scratches on the wall, 5 marks for 5 days. Beyond the narrow mouth of her shelter, the wind screamed like a hungry beast. She closed her eyes and drew in a breath that felt like glass shards in her chest. She knew she could not stay. Rations were gone. Water only existed in frozen granules on her balaclava. So she began to dig. Removing her helmet, she pressed the rim into the icy floor and scraped with the nails she'd bitten down to the quick. Each scoop of snow fell away, revealing harder layers of granular ice. Her fingers bled in the frigid slit of her makeshift cave, but the sting was welcome, a reminder she was still alive. Emily's thoughts drifted to her mother. Warm kitchen light in Eugene, the smell of cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings. Her mother's gentle voice. "Breathe, Em. You've got this." She'd never been so grateful for those words. Digging became a prayer, each movement an echo of her mother's steady reassurance. Hours passed in a rhythm of pain and purpose. Illicit rays of sun stole. Through the entrance, glinting on the snow dust, she kicked aside. She carved until her arms trembled so violently that she could barely hold her ice axe to chip at the ceiling. Still she persisted, hollowing out a space just large enough to sit upright, knees drawn to her chest. Inside the expanding chamber, temperatures rose by a handful of degrees, trapped body heat softening the walls. Emily leaned back against the ice, drawing her legs closer, and allowed herself a moment of stillness. In the dim light, she saw faces flicker in the tunnel walls. Her brother's grin as she'd carried him through the woods. Leila's calm nod when storms on Mount Hood had threatened them both. Those memories were lifelines. By afternoon, Emily had dug enough to fully cover herself with a thin layer of ice shavings, creating insulation like a pale blanket. She curled into a ball, wrapping her remaining mylar blanket around her shoulders. Exhaustion tugged at her eyelids, but she forced herself to stay awake, tapping the wall each hour to prove she was conscious. When her fingers faltered, she used her tongue, tracing the rough carvings of her tally marks. Night fell, and the wind outside intensified into an avalanche of sound. Emily pressed her cheek to the ice floor, blood trickling warmth against her skin. Her breath was shallow, each exhale a cloud of sorrow and defiance. She closed her eyes and whispered a promise. "Come get me, Leila." In the darkness, she dreamed of sunlit peaks and her friend's familiar silhouette waiting with open arms. Then the wind roared, and she awoke, the promise of flame in her chest. Tomorrow she would crawl, but tonight she would rest, wrapped in a tunnel of her own making, a fragile fortress against the white world that had tried to bury her alive. The storm finally relented at dawn's pale edge. At base camp, tents sagged under heavy drifts, and guides wrestled with frozen lines to clear pathways through the moraine. Leila, bundled in layers of borrowed down, stood at the radio tent's entrance. Staring at a swirling horizon, she half expected to swallow itself whole again. Her pulse raced with hope and dread. The thin line between rescue and ruin felt taut as a snapped rope. A murmur rippled through the crew. A glint. Down the slope, just beyond the last tent, a group of local guides and porters knelt in the softening snow. Leila's heart seized as she watched one man brush away fresh powder to reveal the unmistakable shape of an ice axe. Balanced upright, spiked down, haft smeared with frozen crimson. It looked almost deliberate, like a marker planted at an unspoken crossroads. Leila wove through the gathering crowd, her boots crunching on unstable ground. Guides knelt around the axe, speaking in rapid Quechua, pointing, gesturing toward the slope above. One slid a trembling finger along the haft, tracing the wrapped tape that matched Emily's custom grip. Recognition flared in Leila's chest. "That's hers," she whispered, voice raw. "Emily's." A silence fell as the significance of the find settled over the camp. The axe was not a tombstone, it was a beacon. Within moments, Leila was leading a hastily formed search party, crampons clicking on ice as they threaded across the jagged moraine. Her breaths came fast, each step fueled by desperate relief and lingering fear. The axe behind them stood like a silent witness to Emily's struggle, a testament that she had survived long enough to plant hope in the snow. As they climbed, Leila replayed memories of Emily wielding that axe on sunnier climbs, chipping steps into overhanging ice, anchoring crevasse ladders with calm precision. Now it lay half-buried, a lifeline thrown across the chasm of days lost. Guides carried flares to mark their path, their beams carving arcs of orange through the lingering mist. Every beacon rekindled Leila's belief that Emily was alive somewhere above. Reaching the moraine's upper edge, the team discovered a trail of ice chip fragments and smeared footprints leading toward a hidden crevasse wall. Leila's throat tightened. Each sign was a promise etched in frost. She leaned close to the ice face. There, a sliver of silver mylar caught on a rock, its edges curled like a fading flag. It was the same blanket they'd packed 3 days before. With renewed urgency, Leila and 2 guides began to dig, spades slicing through the drift. The world contracted to the scrape of metal on snow and the pounding of her heart. Moments stretched into endless seconds until she hit hollow ground. Kneeling, she reached in and felt fabric. She paused, hand trembling, then pulled free a sheath of ice. Emily's silhouette revealed in rolling breaths beneath the surface. "Emily!" Leila's cry shattered the mountain's hush. Her voice carried across the moraine, calling into the white silence, and at last it answered. A hushed urgency settled over the search team as they stood at the yawning mouth of the crevasse, its black maw rimmed in shifting snow. Guides retreated to lower ledges, their faces drawn with reverence and fear. Leila knelt at the edge, peering into the thin shaft where Emily's faint breath still painted fog against the ice. Above her, the Andes sun glinted off jagged seracs, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. The team's strongest climber, Jose, clipped into a robust anchor and began lowering himself on a taut rope, each meter creaking under his weight. Leila watched, heart pounding, as he disappeared into the narrowing light. Minutes passed like hours before Jose's rope slackened and his distant voice crackled through the radio. "Tent shape, faint breathing." Leila pressed her palm to the icy lip, sending strength down the rope in a silent prayer. Below, the crevasse walls closed in, painted in stripes of blue and white. Jose's headlamp swept the walls until it settled on a fabric glimmer, Emily's mylar blanket, tacked into a niche like a distress signal. He whispered its presence, and Leila's chest tightened. Their pact had bound them on the way up. Now, on the way down, the mountain tested every promise. Jose continued his descent, voice trembling as he called out through the narrow tunnel. "Emily, it's Jose. We've come for you." The echo swallowed his words, but somewhere beyond, a weak rustle answered back. Guided by that tremor, Jose edged toward a small alcove where Emily lay half-buried beneath her icy cocoon. Her face was pale, lips cracked, but her chest rose in shallow, stubborn breaths. Above, Leila felt the rope vibrate as Jose signaled for a haul. Two guides heaved, their muscles straining against the frozen weight. Leila ground her teeth, willing every upward inch. At the rim, she directed each pull, her voice steady despite the tears freezing on her cheeks. 5 meters, 3, and then a gasp as Emily's form breached the surface, eyes fluttering against the harsh light. Leila knelt and swept Emily into her arms, brushing stray ice shards from her hair. Emily's eyes drifted open, confusion giving way first to recognition, then to a flicker of relief so profound it cracked Leila's resolve. "Leila," she whispered, voice barely more than a breath. "You came." The guides moved swiftly, carrying Emily to the snow sled they'd fashioned from a torn tarp and spare rope. Jose descended again to retrieve gear, and together they loaded Emily, securing her splinted leg and tucking her into layers of down. Leila stayed at the sled's head, guiding their slow, perilous ascent back to the moraine. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Crampons bit into slick ice, axes cleaved new holds, and Leila kept her gaze locked on Emily's face, a map of endurance etched in frost. When they finally broke through to the rampart above, the camp, tiny and bright against the white, beckoned like salvation. As they crossed the final stretch, porters and guides gathered, their murmured prayers turning to cheers. Leila rose from the sled to meet Emily, pressing her forehead to her friend's in a silent benediction. Around them, the mountain stood watch, its rough grandeur softened by the promise of rescue. In that moment, every frozen gust and perilous ridge faded behind them, leaving only the fierce bond that had carried Emily back from the depths, and the unspoken vow that no one would ever face the void alone again. A hush fell over base camp as Emily was carried off the sled and laid gently onto a cot inside the medical tent. Lantern light danced on walls slick with condensation, turning every breath into a misted ghost. Leila stood beside her, brushing frost-rimed hair from Emily's forehead. For the first time since departure, Emily's eyes met hers with clarity and a question. "Which day is it?" Emily whispered, voice thin as spun sugar. "Day 6, Leila answered, tears pooling at the corners of her goggles. "You've been in that cave for 6 days." At that, Emily's gaze shifted to the surgical lamp overhead, its harsh glow exposing blackened toes peeking from a blood-soaked boot. A team of medics, Peruvian mountain doctors accustomed to frostbite and high-altitude illness, worked swiftly. One wrapped Emily's feet in warm towels. Another dripped saline into an IV line. The tent buzzed with hushed commands in Quechua and English. Leila hovered, reluctant to leave her side, but a guide placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She's safe now," he said. "Rest." Outside, flags snapped in a brisk breeze. Inside, Emily's breaths deepened as circulation returned to her limbs. She winced as a medic gently manipulated her toes, checking for circulation. Leila held her hand. Emily squeezed back, a tentative promise of strength. When the doctors stepped away, Emily looked around with surprising calm, as if rediscovering the world. Her eyes lingered on a slate-gray piece of ice removed from the cave wall, a shard they'd brought in as evidence of where she'd sheltered. Leila explained how they'd found the alcove, the Axis Trail, the Mylar flag, the excavated snow cavern that had become Emily's lifeline. "Digging froze my hand solid," Emily said, flexing her fingers tentatively. "But it gave me air, space to breathe." She paused, then smiled faintly. "I never meant for you to find me like that." Leila's eyes glistened. "I intended to." Night closed in beyond the tent's canvas, the Andes peaks outlined against a violet sky. Emily lay back, exhaustion etching her face. Leila draped a warm blanket over her friend's shoulders, pressing the shard of ice into Emily's hand. It glinted like a trophy. "Keep it," Emily said softly, "a reminder that I'm stubborn enough to claw out of a tomb." Leila nodded, "And lucky enough to have someone who wouldn't leave me." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the hum of generators and the distant murmur of camp life. The ice cave, once a place of terror and isolation, had become the crucible of Emily's survival. Now, in the warm glow of the tent, it stood as a testament not just to her resilience, but to the unbreakable bond that brought her home. Emily's first memory after waking in the Lima hospital was the antiseptic sting of clipped IV lines and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Daylight filtered through narrow windows high on the wall, painting stripes across the linoleum floor. Leila sat beside her bed, hands clasped around Emily's uninjured one, eyes red-rimmed but steady. Between them lay the scarred remnants of their summit pact, now scrawled across countless heartbreaks and miracles. A doctor in crisp white gloves entered, voice measured, as he examined X-rays on a light board. Leila's breath caught when she saw the blackened toes outlined in ghastly contrast. "Frostbite was severe," he explained, tapping the image. "We've managed to salvage tissue from 4 toes on each foot, but we had to amputate the rest. Prosthetics will be an option." His tone was kind but clinical, leaving no space for unspoken fear. Emily's shoulders rocked with a shuddering exhale. She stared down at her blankets, pressing fingers to damp cheeks. Leila tightened her grip. The doctor stepped back, offering water and time. When the door closed, Emily turned, eyes fierce. "I tried," she said, voice fracturing. "I really tried to come back to you." Leila rose and knelt beside the bed, forehead brushing Emily's. "You did come back. You fought every moment." Guilt twinged in her chest. Guilt for the days of terror, the solo descent, the moments she hadn't called out loud enough. "I kept thinking if I had stayed, if I'd pushed harder into the storm." Emily shook her head, hair tumbling across her cheek. "We practiced leaving no one behind, but surviving alone wasn't the plan." She let out a humorless laugh. "I dug a tomb to save my life." Leila closed her eyes against the memory of climbing into that cavern, digging with bleeding hands, heart pounding in the void. "And that tomb saved you," she whispered. "Without that cave, we'd have lost you forever." They sat in the hush as monitors tracked Emily's uneven pulse. Leila reached for the scrap of paper from Camp 2, their pact drawn in dust and determination. She unfolded it and read aloud. "Here we start, here we end, together." Lines blurred in her vision. Emily's fingers trembled as she took the paper, pressing it to her chest. "We ended apart," she said softly. "But together, you never left." Outside the window, the city pulsed with life. Honking buses, hawkers calling, tourists blinking in the bright sun. Inside, the hospital room became its own world of reckoning. Leila pressed a kiss to Emily's knuckles. "We came back, both of us, with scars, with stories." Emily managed a small smile. "I thought I was digging toward you," she said, voice hushed. "Turns out I was digging toward myself." Leila nodded, tears sliding free. "And I was dragging myself back up the mountain, hoping you'd be at the top." They sat together, two survivors bound by ice and choice, each scar a testament to endurance, each breath a vow reborn. In that quiet room, they found closure, not in the absence of fear, but in the promise that no storm, no matter how white, how vast, could ever erase the bond that carried Emily home. Months later, the chill of the Andes was a distant echo in Emily's bones as she stood before a crowd in a sunlit hall at the University of Oregon. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt, but each word carried the weight of every snow-choked breath in that ice cave. "Survival isn't just about skills," she told them, eyes scanning eager faces. "It's about resolve, creativity, and the people waiting for you at the end." In the front row, Leila watched with pride. She had returned to surgery rotations weeks earlier, her hand steady on the scalpel, but her heart tethered to Emily's resilience. Flashbacks carried her to the frozen slope on Siula Grande, to the moment she found Emily's axe upright in the snow, a beacon of hope, and to the icy alcove where Emily had clawed out life with bleeding fingers. Those memories now fueled her work, reminding her that every patient was fighting their own whiteout. After the talk, students lined up to shake Emily's hand. She posed for photos, signed gear, and heard stories of personal trials, lost jobs, broken hearts, mental storms. She offered simple counsel. Dig your cave, find your thread, keep breathing. Each exchange stitched a new layer onto her own healing. That evening, Emily and Leila sat on a porch overlooking the Mackenzie River Valley, the sky painted in lavender and rose. Leila traced the scar above Emily's eyebrow, a souvenir from a rescue years ago, and said, "You've given so much strength to strangers tonight." Emily turned to her friend, silhouette sharp against the fading light. "I only survived because you never let go of the rope," she replied. "Now I get to carry it forward for others." She tapped the mylar-wrapped notebook in her lap, her new journal of survival stories. Winter arrived with its hush of snow. Unable to ignore the call of the mountains, Emily laced stout boots and shouldered a smaller pack for a solo hike on Spencer Butte, a forested ridge not far from Eugene. She carried only essentials: water, a protein bar, and the ice axe that had waited framed on her wall since her return. As she climbed the familiar trail, memories flickered. Leila's laughter in base camp, the sting of frostbite, the wild hope that had blazed when the axe appeared in the whiteout. Reaching the summit, Emily paused, the valley unfolding below like a patchwork quilt. She raised the axe overhead, sunlight glinting off its edge. In that moment, grief and triumph coalesced into something transcendent, an unspoken promise that both loss and survival could coexist. She planted the axe into the soft earth at the peak's edge, haft side up, mirroring the way it stood in the snow. This time, it wasn't a marker of danger, but of deliverance, a symbol of what survives when the body shivers and the spirit blazes. Below, in the trees, Leila watched from the trailhead. She lifted her hand in salute, and Emily raised hers in reply, two silhouettes joined by an unbreakable line, proof that no storm, no crevasse, no moment of desperation could ever sever the bond forged on a frozen slope in the Andes. And as Emily turned to follow the final descent, both women carried with them a truth sharper than any blade. Together, they could conquer every whiteout life would bring.